David Bowie, 70s albums ranked. It's been a hot minute, but let's jump right into it. Watch the previous 3-minute video on the 60s albums if you want some context, and hey, I make lots of videos like this, so subscribe if you want to see my many other videos like this. Anyway, blah blah blah, Bowie ranking, let's go. Number 11, Pinups. Pinups is a covers album that was made to appease the record company and to string along fans with a release between Aladdin Sane and Diamond Dogs. It was made pretty quickly, it's oftentimes a little over the top in its production, and it's all 60 songs, which, yippee. Honestly, it's an easy pick for bottom, it's nothing too inspired. But at the same time, it's a pretty fun album, and although I think it's one of the worst 70s Bowie albums, I also think it's one of the best cover albums ever made. I don't know, cover albums, they can be fun, and this one puts a lot of interesting spins on classic songs. It's just hard to rank it highly among the many classic 70s Bowie albums. So next up, number 10, Young Americans. This is the album where Bowie went all in on leaving behind glam rock and doing soul music, or as he calls it, plastic soul. It's pretty freaking good and actually very consistent, but I think this one kind of loses me a bit because I don't really like or think of Bowie as being soul music. When I think of David Bowie and what I really like about David Bowie, what comes to mind is his over-the-top glam rock, over-the-top 80s pop, and of course his experimental new wave stuff. So this album is good, it's great even, it's just not exactly my style. So I'm personally putting it lower, but if you were to put it higher, I would respect that, because I know it's a really good album even if it's not exactly my taste. Anyway, next up, number 9, Diamond Dogs. I think this album has a really good first half. It has this ominous narration building track that very satisfyingly transitions to the high energy title track. Then a creepy build brings us to Sweet Thing, which is a really cool and dynamic song that is extended in the next couple tracks. And those tracks eventually throw us into the classic Rebel Rebel, which is the song that this album is really known for. That's side 1. Side 1 is really memorable. Side 2 kind of falls off a bit for me. Rock and Roll With Me is good, but We Are Dead is kind of slow and it's like 5 minutes, and for me it breaks the flow, and I think 1984 brings back the flow a bit, but the last couple songs end up being kind of forgettable, except for the end where Bowie says brah over and over again for about 30 seconds, and I think that stuck with me. All in all though, I think Diamond Dogs is pretty good, even if it has some problems. Anyway, next up, number 8, The Man Who Sold the World. This album is probably the first album by Bowie that feels like it's part of the classic Bowie era. Released in 1970, it was easily his most consistent record to date, and it has some really great songs like All the Madmen, The Width of the Circle, The Supermen, and of course the iconic title track. Really, the only problem with this album is that it has kind of an unfocused middle section and doesn't feel like it's always reaching the clarity or iconicness that future albums would hit. But it was still very close to getting there and still holds up as a good and interesting listen. Next, number 7, Lodger. Lodger is usually called the low point of the Berlin trilogy, while Low and Heroes were these grand, experimental, genre-defining albums that influenced artists like Gary Newman and Visage and helped influence new wave music as a whole. Lodger is a much more straightforward and commercially focused album, which is simply marketed as a collection of songs by David Bowie. It was actually made this way because Bowie was kind of cheesed off that these artists like Gary Newman were imitating his style, yet releasing bigger hits than him. So he decided to try and break off from that and make hits in new styles of funk, R&B, and Afrobeat. And the album may not feel as important or grand as the other 2 entries of the Berlin trilogy, but it's still really good, and it's really strengthened by its diversity of genres. Almost all of the songs are interesting or memorable in some sort of way, and even the few that aren't still don't hurt the ears or break the flow or anything. It's highly overlooked, but also highly recommended by me. Next, number 6, Aladdin Sane. A-Lad Insane. It's a pun. Very cool. This album was written on the road while Bowie was touring America and is sort of penned as being the American Ziggy Stardust album. Side 1 honestly isn't my favorite. Its rock heaviness doesn't stick with me as much as I'm sure it does with other people, but I really like Side 2. Time is cool and emotional and one of my all-time favorite Bowie tracks. Let's Spend the Night Together is a Rolling Stones song, but with a crazy, wacky, infectious piano. The Gene Genie is a classic and his self-penned smorgasbord of imagined Americana. And then the final track, Lady Grinning Soul, is a beautiful and enchanting ballad. And I know I said I don't like Side 1 as much, which is true, but Drive-In Saturday is definitely an exception. It's 50s inspired and has some crazy progressions and out-of-this-world saxophone playing. It's a great album. Not all of it is my style, but the songs that I like from it are ones that I really like. Next up, Number 5, Station to Station. Bowie and his newfound diet of milk and cocaine joined forces to create a crazy album that combines the soul of his previous work with out-of-this-world electronic music that would be explored further on future albums. Bowie was high out of his mind during the production and barely even remembers making this album, yet it is wild. While Young Americans did the dirty work of killing Bowie's glam rock image, which was starting to run thin, this album does the work of replacing that image with something truly iconic, the Thin White Duke, who is similar in soulfulness to Young Americans, but way more over the top and feeling new and special and very much in tune with Bowie. It's a crazy, funky, electronic midway trip between glam rock Bowie and new wave Bowie. Highly recommended. Next. Number 4, Heroes. Heroes is the second album in the Berlin trilogy and the only album to actually be entirely recorded in Berlin. Some of my favorite songs include Beauty and the Beast, The Secrets of Arabia, and of course Heroes, which I don't care if it's popular, it's still one of the best and most important feeling songs ever created. I like almost every song with lyrics on here, but the instrumental side of the album is also a very good deep listen and has points of dissonant chaos, as well as a very serene and dreamily peaceful midsection with Moss Garden. In all, this album is diverse, easily digestible, and extremely powerful at times, featuring some of the highest of highs of the Berlin trilogy. It's one of my all-time favorites and also features my favorite Bowie album cover. Next up, number 3, Hunky Dory. I love Heroes almost as much as I love Low, but I also love Hunky Dory pretty much just as much as I love both of those albums. It was the final album that Bowie released before Ziggy Stardust and his blow up as a big-time rock star, and unlike Ziggy Stardust and unlike really any of Bowie's albums, Hunky Dory is very warm and focused on melodic and sometimes folky art pop, with an interesting influence from the golden age of cinema, which shows in the classy, recolored Hollywood feel of the cover, as well as in some of the lyrics. The album is really consistent, featuring pretty much zero bad or boring songs, and it has some of my favorite Bowie songs, like the jaunty Oh You Pretty Things, the powerful guitar ballad Quicksand, and the fast-paced classical guitar track Andy Warhol. The album also features Queen Bee, which feels like a predecessor to the style of Ziggy Stardust. And it also, of course, has the very classic, very powerful, and very iconic Life on Mars. It's a great album and one of the best of the best. Next, number 2, Low. Low is the first album of the Berlin trilogy and in concept is a recovery piece. It reflects on Bowie's low points of cocaine dependence, a cocaine dependence that gave us the really cool Station to Station, but was overall very bad. The album starts with an exciting instrumental introduction into the new electronic style, and then the rest of side 1 is very consistently made up of wonderfully short and sweet little avant pop songs. As for side 2 of the album, it is made up of much longer and much more ambient electronic tracks. As you probably noticed, a lot of these themes were repeated in Heroes, but I also think that Low did certain things better. I think side 1 is stronger and more consistent than Heroes, even if Heroes maybe has some higher highs. And I personally also enjoy the instrumental side of Low more than I do Heroes, but they're both very good and very different. All in all, it's a really good album and an amazing start to the Berlin trilogy. I would like to consider it my favorite Bowie album of all time, but if I'm being honest with myself, I think that the popular pick here is truly the best. And that is number 1, Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. It's a concept album about a glam rock alien, but also at the same time, it's not really a concept album because its story is hecka loosey-goosey. But honestly, it doesn't even matter, because every single song on this album is amazing and iconic. It's got big songs like Moonage Daydream, Starman, Suffragette City, Lady Stardust, Ziggy Stardust, 5 Years, and Soul Love, but even the tracks that are probably meant to be filler are good. And really, even the cut songs from this album are amazing, like Sweethead and Velvet Goldmine. Like, I don't know, man. I know it's a normie pick, but there's so much to love and gush about this album that it's still my favorite. And boom, that's it. Here's how I would fit the 60s albums into this list. Goodbye.